They were standing just a few steps ahead of us when Lily asked if she could take the picture. Mark handed her my phone, and I watched as she framed the shot, the couple and their 2 kids smiling with the falls roaring behind them. It was sunny, but not too hot, one of those picture-perfect July afternoons where everything feels light and alive. I remember the boy had an orange soda and the little girl had her hair in pigtails with yellow ribbons. Then they were gone. Not like vanished before our eyes, just gone. I didn't think much of it at the time, but 7 years later when I saw that same photo on the news, my stomach dropped through the floor. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. We're the Merrills. I'm Donna, and back in the summer of 2017 I was 45 years old and teaching 3rd grade just outside Rochester. Mark, my husband, had been with the same accounting firm since before we got married. Lily was starting middle school that fall, and Josh had just turned 9. He was obsessed with soccer and, for some reason, orange soda. That year, we finally saved up enough for a real summer trip. Nothing fancy, just a few nights near Niagara Falls. We figured we'd do the Maid of the Mist, let the kids see the lights at night, maybe hit a museum or 2 if we had time. It was the kind of trip where you pack sandwiches in the car and argue about which rest stop has the cleanest bathrooms. We checked into the hotel the night before and spent the whole next morning doing what every other family was doing, walking, pointing, taking pictures. The air smelled like sunscreen and cotton candy. Tour buses hissed past every few minutes, and it felt like everyone there was from somewhere else. That's where we saw them, the other family. I didn't catch their names. We were all milling around the overlook near the edge of Horseshoe Falls. The mom had that teacher-look, practical haircut canvas tote, the kind of woman who probably always remembered extra tissues and hand sanitizer. The dad was tall, clean-cut, looked like someone you'd see coaching Little League. Their kids seemed close in age to ours. The girl had a strawberry slushie and offered Lily a sip. Josh and the boy were comparing souvenir keychains. Mark struck up a quick conversation, something about which vendor had the better ice cream. We were all just passing time, waiting for our turn at the railing. I remember thinking how nice it was in a world that's gotten so guarded to have one of those moments where strangers feel like neighbors. The mom said she wanted one last family photo before they headed to the lot. She held up her phone and I offered to take it for her, but she said they had it set to auto-upload. She took the picture herself, smiling big, all 4 of them. Then they walked off toward the parking area and we headed the opposite way toward the souvenir shop. That was around 3:15. Nothing felt strange. No shouting, no sirens, just sunlight on pavement and the sound of water crashing below. It wasn't until later that night back at the hotel that I noticed something small that didn't sit right. The Hendersons, that's what the news would call them later, hadn't come back to the pool like they said they might. Their car wasn't in the parking lot, and the front desk. They still had their room key waiting in the little cubby. I didn't sleep well that night, not because anything had happened, but because something hadn't. The next morning started quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't set off alarms right away but stays with you a little too long. Mark was still asleep, and I had crept out to the lobby to grab coffee and sit by the window before the crowds picked up. I remember watching a group of kids in matching t-shirts pile into a shuttle van, one of the hotel clerks dragging a rolling cart behind him with breakfast trays. Normal stuff. That's when I noticed the front desk still had the same room key in its cubby, the one for room 312. I didn't think much of it until I saw the name next to it. Henderson. And that was the family we'd talked to the day before. I asked the girl behind the desk if the Hendersons had checked out early, or maybe switched rooms, and she shook her head, chewing on her pen, said they hadn't been seen since yesterday afternoon. Beds untouched, no calls to the front desk, no luggage moved. The cleaning crew had knocked a few times that morning, but no one answered. It wasn't panic yet, just flagged as unusual. She said tourists go off-grid all the time. They might have gone somewhere spontaneous. but something about that didn't sit right with me. We hadn't planned to visit the falls again that day, but I told Mark and the kids I wanted to swing by before heading out of town. The lot was already filling up when we pulled in. I walked the same path we'd taken the day before, down past the benches, past the vendor cart that had sold those colorful drinks. I looked around like I expected to see them, the same pigtails, the same slushy cup. Nothing. Just tourists' maps flapping kids on parents' shoulders. I even asked the vendor if he remembered the family, the 2 kids, the red shirt with the ice cream cone. He said it sounded familiar, but this time of year he sees 100 families a day. I didn't press. Back at the hotel around noon, things started shifting. The front desk manager came out, asked if I had spoken to them recently. I said no. She mentioned the family hadn't checked back in, hadn't used their keycard since the day before, and their cell phones were going straight to voicemail. That's when they decided to call the local police, not for an emergency, just a welfare check. Standard policy. A patrol car showed up around 1:30. Officer Delgado, I think his name was. Older guy, calm voice, good with people. He went up to the room with a second officer, knocked, used the staff key to enter. When they came back down, their expressions had shifted. Not panic, but something more alert. One of them called it in, flagged it as suspicious circumstances. That's how fast it moved. By mid-afternoon, 2 more cruisers had arrived and a plainclothes detective showed up not long after. I watched the lobby turn into something else. Radios buzzed, people whispered. The hotel staff kept doing their jobs, but something was different now. The detective asked if anyone had seen or interacted with the family the day before. I gave my name and told them what I remembered: the photo near the overlook, the drinks, the chat by the rail. He asked if I remembered what time we saw them. I said it had to be around 3:15 because Josh had asked to go to the arcade after, and I had checked my watch. He nodded and wrote it down. Later that night, I got a call on my cell from the same Detective Santos, I think her name was. She asked if I'd be willing to come back in the morning, maybe look at some security footage. Said it might help narrow the timeline. I agreed, but before I could even get there, things had escalated. The Hendersons' car was missing from the hotel lot. Not just moved, gone. That was when the real worry set in. It wasn't just that they hadn't returned. It was that everything they'd brought, clothes, toiletries, even the souvenir bags, were still in the room. But their phones had gone dark at 3:22 p.m., just 7 minutes after we last saw them, and their rental car had vanished. No toll activity, no credit card use. Just nothing. Detective Santos showed me a short clip from the observation deck security camera. It was grainy, but you could see the Hendersons walking toward the exit, relax the kids bouncing along the pavement. Nothing looked out of place. The timestamp read 3:15. That matched what I'd said. Then came the still frame from a parking lot camera. The family again walking toward their car. 3:17 p.m. You could see the little girl skip ahead, the boy holding what looked like a folded park map. And that was it. No footage of the car leaving. No camera picked up which direction they went. It was like they had vanished between one camera angle and the next. The police checked all the major roads, pulled footage from nearby businesses, toll booths, gas stations. The license plate was entered into the system. Alerts went out to departments across the state. At first it was categorized as a missing persons case. But privately, I could see it on their faces. Something about it wasn't sitting right. 2 days later, we got word from a friend at the hotel the FBI had joined the investigation. That doesn't happen over a late checkout. I kept thinking about that moment at the overlook. The mom checking her phone. The dad laughing about overpriced water bottles. The kids trading sips of those slushy drinks. There was nothing strange about them. Not nervous, not hurried. If something had happened after that, it came out of nowhere. A few days later, a tip came in. An anonymous call. Someone claimed they'd seen a silver Camry, same make and model as the Hendersons' rental, speeding down a back road 20 miles east of the falls around 4:30 p.m. on the day they vanished. The caller described the car in detail, even the plate number matched. The road they mentioned wasn't a tourist route. It wasn't even paved in parts. It led into dense forest, old logging paths, and access trails. Places no family would end up by accident. Officers were dispatched immediately. They found tire tracks, but it had rained the day before. Nothing concrete. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew grid patterns. They pushed deep into the woods until the terrain became too thick to navigate safely. No car. No footprints. Just disturbed underbrush and a trail that went cold where the tree canopy blocked aerial visibility. They had to pull back. I remember watching the coverage that night on TV. The photo they kept showing was the same one we'd seen being taken, the family lined up with the falls behind them, smiling like nothing could go wrong. Seeing that image again, knowing it was the last one ever taken of them, did something to me. It felt like I had stepped into a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. Like I'd witnessed the last ordinary moment of someone else's life without realizing it. By the end of that week, the search around Niagara had turned up nothing. The car was still missing. So were the Hendersons. What was left were 2 timestamps and a growing list of unanswered questions. Then, late one night, I got a second call. This time it wasn't about helping. It was just the detective's voice, quiet, steady. She said, "There's something we might have missed. Something about the road." And then she asked a question that sat in my chest long after the line went dead. "Did you happen to see anyone near their car who wasn't with them?" I didn't know what to say. But I knew what I had felt. Something that hadn't sat right. And now it was starting to move. When she asked if I'd seen anyone near their car, I wanted to say yes. I wanted to give her something. Some face. Some flash of movement. Something real. But all I could remember was the way the boy had held the map. The girl's hair ribbons, the dad reaching for his keys. The only thing that stuck with me was a sense, not a sight. Like when you pass someone too quickly to place, but something about them sits wrong afterward. I told Detective Santos I wasn't sure. I said I might have noticed someone just standing nearby by the edge of the lot, but I couldn't swear it. She thanked me anyway, said a maybe was better than silence, said she'd heard a lot of silence in the last few days. By then the story was already slipping into the news cycle. Local stations started running short clips, family of 4 missing after visit to Niagara Falls. It hadn't gone national yet, but you could feel it coming. The hotel cleared the Hendersons' room but didn't clean it. Forensics had been through twice. Staff were told not to touch anything unless instructed. The front desk clerk, the same young woman who'd checked us in, was asked to write a full statement. I remember she looked like she hadn't slept since Sunday. We were still in touch with Santos, off and on. She called again later that week to ask if Lily or Josh had mentioned anything about the other kids, or if Mark remembered which direction the Hendersons were walking when we split off. It was little things, always small questions, like building a puzzle without the corners. That Friday, Mark and I decided to drive back down on our own. Not to be helpful, really, just because we couldn't stop thinking about it. We stood in the same spot near the overlook where they'd taken the photo. I held up my phone and lined it with the guardrail. I tried to imagine what the mom must have seen when she took that shot. Nothing looked out of place. The water still thundered. Tourists still smiled. But it didn't feel the same anymore. By the second week, the missing persons flyers had gone up in rest stops and post offices across the state. Their picture, the one from the overlook, was everywhere. Mark taped a copy in his office window. Lily asked if we could print one for her school's bulletin board. It all felt strange doing something so small for people we'd only known for 15 minutes. But I think we were all trying to keep the family visible, like if enough people looked, they wouldn't stay missing. Then the stories started. A woman in Erie claimed she saw the girl in a diner bathroom, said she was alone and looked scared. A man in Syracuse reported spotting the silver Camry on the highway, but when police checked the traffic cameras, it turned out to be a different car entirely. Someone in Albany called in a tip that the parents had checked into a motel under new names. That one made it onto Facebook before it was debunked. The worst were the calls from people just trying to feel important. A self-proclaimed psychic said the family was trapped in a cave. Another claimed they'd run off to start a new life in Mexico. Santos had to field them all. She told me later that every false lead still had to be chased down because you never knew when one wouldn't be. When the FBI joined the investigation in late August, the tone shifted. It stopped being a local concern. I think that's when people really started paying attention. The agent who showed up was named Wallace. Mid-40s, quiet type, clean suit, never said more than necessary. He stood in the parking lot with Santos and walked through the path we'd all taken that day. I could see them talking, tracing every step between the camera footage and the edge of the woods, the same stretch of road where that anonymous call had reported seeing the Camry now fully mapped, logged, and cordoned off. But here's the thing I didn't understand at the time. Even with the FBI involved, even with dogs, helicopters, and grid searches, nothing was turning up. No car, no clothing, no electronics pinged. All 4 cell phones had cut out at the exact same time. Santos told me it was 3:22 p.m. on the dot, not staggered, all at once. She said that made it less likely they'd just driven out of range or dropped signal. It suggested a deliberate shutdown. But who would do that? And why? As weeks turned to months, something else began to settle over the town. Not panic, not really fear either. It was more like doubt. People stopped talking about the Hendersons at the diner. The front desk clerk quit. One of the vendors at the park said she didn't want her kids working there anymore. And the part that stuck with me, some folks began to wonder aloud if the family had ever really been there at all. I heard a woman at the grocery store say, "Sounds like they planned it. Probably a custody thing." Someone else muttered about witness protection. All kinds of theories, most of them coming from people who'd never seen the children's faces. Even people I thought would know better started questioning the timeline. Said it was odd that no one saw the car leave. Said the kids might have been trained to stay quiet. A few hinted it was suspicious that I'd spoken to them before they vanished. One person, a woman I'd volunteered with years ago, asked if I'd noticed anything off about the mother. Her tone, her behavior, the way she took that photo. I told her she seemed kind. Tired, maybe, but kind. When Santos heard those rumors, she was furious. Not loud, just tense the way people get when they're holding something in. She said families don't vanish because they're unhappy. They vanish because someone makes them disappear. I believed her. I still do. What came next, though, was harder to explain. One night in early September, Santos called and asked me if I could come in. She had something she wanted me to hear. It wasn't a recording, not yet. Just a statement from a driver who'd come forward about seeing a car, a silver Camry, on an unmarked back road leading toward the forest edge. The same area as the earlier anonymous tip. Only this time the driver said he saw 2 vehicles, the Camry, and a dark-colored pickup following close behind. The second car hadn't been mentioned before, and according to him, it didn't have plates. That detail didn't make it to the news. Not right away. Santos said they were holding it back to filter real tips from noise. But for me, it was the moment something shifted. Because it meant the family hadn't just gotten lost. Someone had followed them. And maybe, just maybe, someone had been watching long before that last photo was ever taken. After the tip about the second vehicle, things started to change slowly, but you could feel it. There was a shift in the way people talked about the case, the way they looked at the footage, the maps, the timestamps. Detective Santos began pulling longer hours. I remember her telling me one night quietly that the hardest part wasn't not knowing. It was the feeling that they'd been close, just a few degrees off from seeing it clearly. I believed her. I think we all did. But for the rest of us, life kept going. Mark went back to work. The kids started school again, and I found myself checking local news more than I wanted to admit, not even for new developments, just to make sure the Hendersons hadn't disappeared from the story completely. It's strange how silence takes over. You start second-guessing the moments you thought you remembered. I replayed that last image of them smiling, relaxed, walking toward the lot. I'd stare at it until I could almost convince myself they were still out there somewhere. Maybe they'd driven off to start over. Maybe they'd gotten scared and gone into hiding. The theories weren't comforting, but they kept me from settling on the worst one. I think that's what a lot of people did. They filled in the silence however they could. But Santos didn't stop working it. I know that because she called me in late October. Just a short message. She said, "Still here, just turning over old ground." I didn't know what that meant until I drove past the falls the following weekend and saw them. A small search crew, not as large as before, combing the same patch of woods they'd already gone through in July. Same dogs, same flags marking soft earth. The only difference was how quiet it had become. No cameras this time. No press. Just a quiet, deliberate return to the place they had already gridded out once and left behind. By winter, snow had covered most of the trailheads. The road where the tip came in where the Camry had allegedly been seen was barely passable by then. The county closed part of it off for the season. Still, every once in a while I'd see tire tracks in the snow from someone heading in anyway. I had a feeling I knew who it was. Santos kept at it long after the press stopped calling. And not just her. There was a small group, a local dive volunteer, a retired forestry officer, and a few searchers from a K-9 team who refused to let it go. But outside that circle, people started to move on. The Henderson School District in Rochester removed Sarah from their faculty page in January. Michael's name was quietly taken off his company's tax documents. Emma and Josh were listed in one of those "Where Are They Now" end-of-year articles that true crime blogs post around the holidays. No one meant any harm by it. It's just how the world resets when too much time passes without answers. I stopped bringing them up unless someone asked. It felt like holding on to a shadow. Even Lily, who'd been the one to snap their photo, started asking less about them. I think she didn't want to see me keep looking sad. Or maybe she just knew it was too heavy for any of us to carry much longer. But then spring came. And with it, something strange. I was scrolling through the local news when I saw an article buried at the bottom of the page. It mentioned a photographer, Jake Morrison, who was working on a forest recovery project for the state. He'd been commissioned to fly drones over storm-damaged sections of woodland about 25 miles east of the falls. The storms had knocked down trees the previous winter, exposing areas that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Most of it was environmental work, documenting new growth mapping clearings, tracking wildlife. But something about the location caught my eye. It overlapped with the area where the Hendersons' car had been reported months earlier. The same stretch of dense forest, the same rough mileage. I remember staring at the name in the article and thinking, why does this sound important? 2 days later, Santos called again. This time her voice was different. Not urgent, not excited, just steady. She asked if I had a minute to talk. I stepped outside and she told me that Jake Morrison had found something on one of his drone flights. Not a body, not a person, just something that wasn't supposed to be there. She didn't say what, not over the phone, only that she and a team were heading in that morning. The site was remote, barely accessible even with specialized equipment. It was going to take time. But she promised to call again once they reached it. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning the news hadn't broken yet, not officially. But by mid-afternoon, word had started spreading among local law enforcement circles. The drone had picked up the outline of a vehicle nearly hidden under 7 years of overgrowth. It wasn't visible from the air before, not with the tree canopy as thick as it had been. But the storm had changed that. It opened up the sky just enough to show what had been buried in plain sight. The car was silver. The shape was consistent with a Toyota Camry. The GPS coordinates placed it less than 300 yards from where the original search had ended back in 2017. Somehow, despite all the manpower, all the dogs, all the aerial scans, they had stopped just short of it. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the grainy still frame from the drone footage that someone had texted me. I wasn't supposed to have it, but I did. And even through the moss and fallen branches, even blurred and pixelated, I knew. It was their car. It had to be. Forensics were called in that same day. A crime scene team spent the next 48 hours carefully clearing vegetation, photographing every angle, cataloging every item. They didn't open the vehicle until the third day. When they did, they found personal belongings that matched what we'd all seen in that last photo. Sarah's canvas tote, the kids' backpacks, Michael's sunglasses. It was all there, untouched. And yet, no sign of the family themselves. What they did find, restraint marks, torn fabric fingerprints on the interior window glass, was enough to reclassify the case. It was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was now officially being treated as a crime. And somewhere out there, whoever had done this had been walking free for 7 years. Maybe still close by, maybe watching, maybe someone we'd all already seen. That possibility settled in the back of my throat and stayed there heavy and still. Because if they were capable of making a family vanish and hiding it this well, what else had we missed? What else were we still walking past without seeing? And if that car had been found only by chance, what else was still waiting in the trees? They started processing the car at first light. It took a full day just to clear enough debris to open all the doors. The forest had pushed its way in over the years, moss clinging to the dash vines twisted through the cracked back window. It was like the woods had been trying to erase it. But once the forensic team stepped in, that illusion was gone. Every inch of the interior was photographed, cataloged, and handled with gloved hands. I wasn't there, of course. But Santos called that night, her voice slower than usual. She said, "We found something in the trunk. We're not ready to share all of it yet, but you were right. This wasn't just disappearance. It was violence." The next morning, the press finally got the headline they'd been circling for years: "Missing family's vehicle recovered evidence of foul play, confirmed." It made the national news within hours. And from that point on, everything moved fast. They found duct tape, zip ties, a crowbar rusted but intact. Not the sort of things a family would bring on vacation. And they found clothing. A child's t-shirt torn near the neckline. A pair of soccer shorts faded and stiff from something no one wanted to say out loud yet. Blood tests confirmed what everyone feared. The stains belonged to Emma and Josh. The car had been a time capsule sealed by the elements, but it hadn't kept its secrets perfectly. There were prints. Partial ones lifted from the steering wheel and the trunk latch. Smudged, but still readable. There were also fibers, gray coarse, caught along the seatbelt mechanism and tucked beneath the floor mat in the back. Santos told me later they found impressions in the upholstery, shallow but consistent with restraints. Zip ties or rope. Possibly both. Michael's wallet was still in the center console. Sarah's purse sat on the passenger seat. Every sign pointed to a struggle, but a fast one. Controlled. The children's backpacks were untouched. One of them had a postcard tucked inside, still blank. It was addressed, though, to Dorothy, their grandmother, the stamp already affixed. When I heard that detail, I had to sit down. That postcard had been sitting in that car for 7 years waiting to be sent. And now it never would. The lab results came back in pieces. Blood, yes. But something else too, DNA profiles that didn't belong to the Hendersons. 2 additional sets. 1 male, 1 undetermined. No hits in the federal database. That meant no prior arrests. No military service. No known history. Ghosts. But not invisible. The fibers matched a commercial brand of work gloves sold at a hardware chain based in Buffalo. So they pulled every store receipt security video and transaction from the week leading up to July 15, 2017. That's when they found him. A man had walked into a hardware store on July 13th, 2 days before the family vanished, and paid cash for zip ties, duct tape, and a crowbar. He wore a baseball cap, pulled low, kept his head down. But the cameras caught enough. His build, his gait, the way he checked behind him twice before reaching the register. The clerk remembered him too. Said he was sweating even though the store had air conditioning. Looked like he was in a hurry. The receipt was time-stamped 5:42 p.m. They ran his image through everything: facial recognition, DMV records, missing persons. Nothing. Until someone called the tip line. A woman, soft-spoken, mid-30s. Said she recognized the man in the footage. Said his name was David Coleman. That name didn't mean anything to me at the time, but Santos knew it. The woman on the phone said she used to date him, that they broke up because of things he said, things she thought were jokes at first. He liked missing persons stories, was obsessed with the Henderson case specifically, knew details that weren't public, told her once that families like that were too easy. When she confronted him, he laughed, said he was just playing around, but after the car was found, she got scared. She gave them his address 40 miles east on a stretch of land surrounded by trees. They didn't knock on his door right away. The FBI set up surveillance first. Watched the house, tracked his movements. He lived alone. Rarely left. When he did, it was late at night. He drove different vehicles. One day, a gray sedan. Another day, a pickup with no plates. The team kept eyes on the property for 3 nights. The third night, he loaded heavy black bags into the back of a truck. Struggled with the weight. Looked around too many times. That was enough. They moved in before sunrise. No warning. He didn't run. Didn't even act surprised. When they cuffed him, all he said was, "Took you long enough." Inside his house, they found maps, cutouts, articles, photos of the Hendersons printed from the internet and circled in red pen. In the shed out back, there were tools, ones that matched the ones recovered from the car. In a crawl space beneath the floorboards, they found children's clothes that didn't belong to Emma or Josh. Santos told me all of this quietly over the phone, like she was still trying to accept it herself. "We got him," she said, "but we're not sure he was alone." She was right. The lab confirmed it, those 2 sets of DNA from the car. One belonged to David Coleman. The other didn't. He denied it at first. Said he worked alone. Said he followed the family, took them, killed them, buried them. Said he'd been preparing for something like this for years. He described watching Sarah take that final photo. Said he was 30 feet away, waiting for the crowd to thin. He'd followed them to the parking lot, asked Michael for directions, hit him when he looked down at the map, forced them into the car at gunpoint, told the kids to stay quiet, drove them out of town through back roads to the forest. He gave them a location, a spot deep in the woods. Said he'd dug a pit days before just in case. Said he changed his mind about letting them go after Josh asked too many questions. Said Emma kept crying. He told all of this like it was logistics, like he was talking about moving boxes. But when they pressed him about the second man, he froze. Said there wasn't one. Wouldn't give a name. Wouldn't admit it even when they showed him the results. Wouldn't say how he dragged a full-grown man and 2 children through that terrain alone. Wouldn't say how he covered so much distance so fast without help. That was the gap. The part that didn't make sense, and it was the part that would matter most because if he wasn't alone, someone else was still out there. They excavated the area he described. It took days. But what they found matched his story. 4 sets of remains. 1 adult male, 1 adult female, 2 children. Each in separate burial plots, spaced evenly like someone had measured the distance. Michael, Sarah, Emma, and Josh accounted for. Finally. But closure doesn't always come with answers. And the question Santos kept circling back to like a loop she couldn't stop tracing was this. If David Coleman never planned to stop, why didn't he keep going? And then came the answer she didn't expect. He didn't stop. He just hadn't been caught yet. Not all of him. Not yet. They brought David Coleman back into the interview room 3 days after the burial site was recovered. Santos didn't tell me this directly, but someone in the task force passed it along. Not gossip, just quiet disbelief. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for water. He just sat there and waited. When they finally walked in, he said, "You found them like it was some kind of confirmation." He looked calm, almost relieved. Said he'd known it would happen eventually, but didn't think it would take this long. He said he'd been ready to talk since the moment they brought him in, but only when they were ready to listen to everything. That was the word he used. Everything. The confession came out in pieces. First, the familiar timeline, the parking lot, the map, the weapon, the car ride into the woods, the fear, the silence, the pit. He explained how he'd planned it. Watched them for 2 days before the attack, picked that stretch of forest because he knew the tree coverage was too thick for aerial scans, studied search and rescue field guides to understand how teams grid off terrain. He said the key was to bury the car far enough from the graves that dogs wouldn't catch a crossover scent. And that if you moved the bodies after a few weeks, it confused the timeline for decomposition and scattered trace material. He didn't say it with pride. He said it like someone reading off a list they'd memorized long ago. Like the facts had stopped meaning anything once the work was done. What Santos and the team wanted, what they kept circling back to, was the second set of DNA. The unknown profile from the trunk, the gloves, the partial prints outside the rear passenger door. Coleman denied it at first, said he worked alone, but they pressed. Asked how he could have managed the logistics, the cleanup, the transportation, and slowly the cracks started to show. He stopped answering in absolutes. Started saying things like it was mostly me and I handled the important parts. Finally, under pressure, he admitted there had been someone else. Someone who helped plan it. Someone who had been there, maybe not for every second, but enough to count. His name was Thomas Coleman, David's younger brother. Lived about an hour away in a smaller town, worked part-time as a mechanic, and took odd jobs fixing equipment on seasonal farms. Never married. No kids, no record. David claimed Thomas had been the one to help move the car. That he'd driven a second vehicle behind them, kept lookout from the tree line, and helped dig the original burial site. He said the plan was his own, that Thomas had doubts, but never backed out. Said they never talked about it afterward. Never needed to. They picked Thomas up the next morning just after sunrise. He was at work under the hood of an old Jeep with bad suspension. When the agents arrived, he stepped back and held up his hands like he already knew why they were there. They said he didn't say much until they showed him the DNA results. Then he just sat down on the curb outside the garage and stayed there quiet while the cuffs were clipped around his wrists. His house was clean, sparse. No computer, no internet. A few framed photos on a shelf, none recent. In the garage out back, though, they found what mattered. A bench lined with tools that had been scrubbed too clean. A drawer of old road maps with red ink tracing routes through the woods. A shoebox filled with receipts, cash purchases from hardware stores, gas stations, truck stops. None incriminating on their own, but too consistent to ignore. And there was something else. A plastic crate stored behind a false panel beneath the stairs. Inside were personal items, small things. A locket, a child's glove, a cracked pair of sunglasses. None of them belonged to the Hendersons. For the first time, the task force had to consider that this might not have started or ended with one family. Thomas didn't confess outright. He claimed he was manipulated. Said David had always been the one with plans, with ideas, that he never meant to hurt anyone. that he was only there to help clean up something that had already gone too far. But when they laid out the sequence of events, the purchases, the footprints at the site, the phone pings near the border of the forest, he stopped talking. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't want to explain what he knew came next. The most disturbing find came a few days later in a rented storage unit registered under a fake name. It was in the back row of a long strip of units outside of town, locked with a heavy rusted padlock. The contents were organized with chilling precision: a sealed case of restraints, a duffel bag filled with tarps and chemical solvents, another box filled with labeled folders, each with maps, surveillance photos, handwritten notes. Some were dated, some weren't. One folder was labeled Spring Lake Campground. Another had the name of a family printed on the front, people the team hadn't heard of before. A quick check showed they had disappeared in 2015 during a trip to a state park 2 counties over. Their car had been found months later at the bottom of a ravine ruled accidental. Now that wasn't so clear. It wasn't just one plan. There were multiple, scattered over years, different targets, different locations. The Hendersons had been the most ambitious 4-people middle-of-summer high tourist visibility. It was supposed to be the last one for a while. But there was already another plan in motion, something marked out for early fall. It involved a campsite, a family reunion, 15 people. That's when it hit everyone the Hendersons weren't a one-off. They were a part of a larger pattern, one that had stayed invisible because the dots were spread so far apart. Different jurisdictions. No cross-reporting. Missing families assumed to be accidents or runaways or custody disputes. But with the evidence now in hand, law enforcement started pulling case files, and suddenly things began to click. The Brennan family in Ohio, the Wilsons from Pennsylvania, the newlyweds from Florida who vanished during a hiking trip in the Adirondacks. Names that had been buried in old news cycles, now all part of the same chain. I remember sitting with Mark in the living room the evening the press conference aired. Santos stood at the podium, her hair pulled back, face drawn but steady. She spoke plainly, confirmed the arrests, acknowledged the wider investigation. She didn't give names of other victims, just said, "We are beginning to connect cases that should have been connected years ago." I thought about that first afternoon at the Overlook, the sound of the falls, the moment before we knew what was coming. And then I thought about what David Coleman had said during his confession. The line that stuck. I didn't stop because I felt guilty. I stopped because they started looking too close. And I couldn't help but wonder how many others had stopped looking just a little too soon. The first trial began on a cold morning in January. David Coleman was led into the courtroom wearing standard-issue khakis, wrists cuffed, face expressionless. I watched the live feed from our kitchen table, the audio slightly out of sync, the image grainy like a bad signal from a cable channel we weren't supposed to get. Mark sat beside me in silence, one hand cupped around his coffee but not drinking it. It had been 7.5 years since that day at Niagara Falls. And now here we were watching the man who had made a family disappear explain why he did it. The prosecution began with the facts, those things we had heard before, but still felt new when said aloud in a room built for judgment. The duct tape, the zip ties, the fibers in the car, the blood on the clothing. A slow, steady rhythm of evidence that needed no embellishment. They brought in experts from the lab investigators who had worked the site, even the drone pilot, Jake Morrison, who first spotted the Camry from above. Each took their seat, spoke plainly, and left the room a little heavier than when they entered. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just proof. But what none of us were ready for, what left even the courtroom still, was when David took the stand. His lawyer had tried to keep him off it, said it wasn't necessary, but David insisted. He wanted to speak. And when he did, it was like watching a man recite instructions he'd read from a manual one too many times. He described how he had chosen the Hendersons, how he had followed them through the park, how he had waited for the moment when they would be tired, distracted, and alone. He explained the parking lot interaction step by step, never raising his voice, never lowering it. As if he were reading it off a checklist he'd committed to memory long ago. Not once did he look at the camera. Not once did he apologize. When asked if he felt remorse, he said no. When asked why he did it, he said, "Because I could." The judge interrupted at one point, told him to speak only when prompted. But David didn't need prompting. He spoke about the children as if they were variables, about Sarah's pleading as if it were noise. He admitted to revisiting the site more than once, not to mourn, but to make sure he hadn't been followed. He kept track of the news, joined a few search parties, told a volunteer once that he hoped they were found safe. "I said it just like that," he added, with the right tone. People believe the right tone. By the time the prosecutor asked the jury to deliberate, it wasn't about whether he was guilty. That part was already done. It was about whether they believed he was sane enough to know what he was doing. The defense made a final plea called a clinical psychologist who described antisocial personality traits, childhood trauma isolation. But it didn't matter. David had already made himself clear. When the jury returned less than 3 hours later, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to life without parole plus 200 years, not because he'd asked for it, but because he hadn't. Thomas's trial came 6 months later. The courtroom looked the same, but the mood was different. More cautious, more complicated. Thomas wasn't defiant. He didn't confess. He didn't even speak. His attorneys leaned on the claim that he'd been manipulated, that his older brother had controlled him since they were kids, that he never planned to harm anyone and didn't fully understand what was happening until it was too late. They brought in family friends who described Thomas as quiet, obedient, dependent. Showed old school records, doctor's notes, stories about the way David had always decided where they lived, what they did, how they earned money. But then came the evidence. The journal from the storage unit, the marked maps, the receipts, the emails written under fake names sent from a borrowed computer at a rural library, the witnesses who recalled seeing him load shovels into the back of a pickup, a former co-worker who testified that Thomas once asked if anyone ever really looked into missing hiker cases. And then there was the photo taken 2 months before the Hendersons vanished. A blurry image captured by a wildlife camera just off a trailhead in upstate New York. It showed 2 men side by side carrying tools and a tarp. The timestamp matched one of the plans in the journal. Thomas's face was in the photo. Still, the jury wrestled with it. Took 2 full days. In the end, they found him guilty of conspiracy and accessory to multiple murders, but they stopped short of giving him the same sentence as David. The judge followed their recommendation, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He'll be eligible in 2049. Whether anyone will stand up for him, then I don't know. After the trials, the story left the headlines. The families of the other victims, the ones we didn't even know were part of this, held their own services, gave their own interviews, started their own quiet battles with grief. The names were different. The years varied, but the shape of the loss was the same. People who left for a trip and never came back. The Brennan girls from Ohio, the Wilsons from Pennsylvania, the young couple from Florida who vanished near the Adirondacks. Their faces were never on the same flyers as the Hendersons, but now they were part of the same story. Sarah's mother, Dorothy, was the only one who spoke at the final press conference. She stepped to the microphone with a piece of paper in her hands but didn't look down at it once. She said, "Justice doesn't bring them home. It just keeps someone else from being taken. And for now, that's enough." Then she folded the paper quietly and walked away. I thought about her words for a long time, the way she said someone else. Because the truth is, if Jake Morrison hadn't flown that drone, if the wind hadn't knocked down those trees, if David Coleman hadn't misjudged just one angle of that forest, then maybe we'd all still be waiting. Maybe Dorothy would still be checking voicemail every morning. Maybe the Hendersons' room at the hotel would still be sitting empty, untouched, since July 2017. Instead, there was a funeral, 4 names etched into one stone, and a growing sense that the story wasn't quite finished. Because while David had confessed, while Thomas had been sentenced, there were still things that didn't fit. An extra pair of gloves, a second shadow in one of the campground photos, a half-written plan for a location that hadn't yet been matched to a victim, and tucked inside one of those folders from the storage unit under layers of maps and notes was something no one could explain. A list of names, some crossed out, some not. One of the names hadn't been made public yet. It was written in red ink, and it belonged to a family that was still alive. I didn't sleep much after seeing that name. It was handwritten in a different ink red, not black like the rest. No last name, just Griffin, Tennessee with a faint circle drawn around it and a small check mark in pencil off to the side. There was no cross out, no date. I stared at it so long I started to question whether I had really seen it, whether maybe I'd misread the scrawl entirely. But then I turned the page and tucked in the corner was a receipt from a bait shop outside Knoxville. And taped beside it, folded down the middle, was a brochure from a family-owned campground called Whisper Pines, with a hand-drawn map of Cabin 3 and the number 18 circled in the margins. I called Detective Alvey in Nashville first. I wasn't even sure if it was still his number. He'd worked cold cases for most of his career and had helped identify one of the earlier victims in the Coleman file. I didn't know if he'd care about an unverified lead or if I was stepping over a line, but I told him everything. The storage unit, the folder, the name, the check mark. When I mentioned the campground brochure, there was a pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but it was heavy. He asked me to email scanned copies, and then he hung up without saying much else. The next morning he called back. His voice was quieter. He said, "There's a missing persons report from 2016 that never got traction. A woman and her 2 kids, same last name. Husband was ruled out early. They'd checked into a place called Whisper Pines on a weekend trip. Never checked out. No vehicle ever recovered. Local search ran for weeks. Turned up nothing. I asked if the mother's first name was Erin." Another pause. Then, "Yeah, Erin Griffin." Why I told him there was a note scrawled under the map. It just said, July 16th, perfect cover. The date matched the check-in. There was no signature, no initials, just that one line. Within 3 days, Alvey had driven out there himself. He walked the site, talked to the new manager, checked county permits. Whisper Pines had changed hands twice since 2016. Cabin 3 had been renovated and renumbered, now listed as 18A. Most of the paper records from that year were gone, but in the maintenance shed behind a rusted filing cabinet, they found a box labeled Old Water Logs. Inside were site reports from summer 2016, including one from July 17th noting a broken septic line near the cabin in question. There'd been digging, a repair made without formal documentation. Alvey called in cadaver dogs 2 days later. They found partial remains buried near the edge of the old line under a shallow spread of gravel and fill. DNA later confirmed the smallest belonged to a boy no older than 5. Erin's and her daughter's remains weren't recovered at the site, but hair fibers and bone fragments were found in the soil nearby. Too degraded to test, but consistent with the timeline. I remember staring at the photos once the report came out. Not the forensics, those I couldn't look at for long, but the cabin itself. The siding was painted a dull green warped near the base. A porch swing hung slightly off level. It looked exactly like the sketch from the folder. Every small detail matched. That same week, the DA's office in Davidson County opened a new file and officially linked the Griffin case to David Coleman. The timeline fit. The map was his. The notation his handwriting. That brought the victim count to 12, spanning 4 states over a decade. But the red ink, that's what stuck with me. The other names had been added in bulk, grouped by location or time frame. But Griffin stood alone. Different pen, separate circle, no crossout. Alvy thought it might have been written after the others. A late edition. Or worse, someone else's edition. Because buried in the back of the folder behind a list of supply runs and burner phone contacts was a sheet labeled Alt Sites Pending, and there near the bottom was a name no one recognized. It wasn't a missing person. It wasn't in any file. It simply read Mathis in process. With no location, no date, just that. The ink matched the red. I brought it up during a post-case briefing with the federal team. The lead agent, a woman named Ruiz, asked for a scan and said they'd run it through their systems. She didn't say much else, just that the handwriting would be analyzed against both Coleman Brothers samples and that every known associate was being re-examined. But I could tell it bothered her too. She lingered on that line longer than the rest. When I asked if she thought someone else was still out there, maybe someone the Colemans worked with, she didn't answer directly. Just said, "We may never know how many names were left off that list." After that, things got quieter. Most of the press moved on. Dorothy Henderson made one last appearance, this time for a memorial bench installed at the state park trailhead. She spoke briefly about the kindness of strangers, about the families that would come to sit and look out over the valley where the drone had first spotted the car. Then she left without speaking to reporters. I stayed behind a few minutes longer, reading the plaque. There was no mention of the investigation, no list of names, just 4 words etched into the wood. "You led us home." I don't know who wrote that line. Maybe it was Dorothy. Maybe someone from the search team. But it stayed with me. Because in the end, that's what this all came down to. Not closure, not revenge. Just that one fragile act bringing people home, even if only in pieces. Still late at night, I think about the names that didn't get circled. The ones written in red. The ones no one ever filed a report for. And the strange silence around that last entry, Mathis. In process. Because if there's anything this case taught me, it's that what's buried doesn't always stay hidden. And not every list ends when the ink runs out. I kept the folder in my desk drawer for months after the case closed. Not because I needed it for anything official, those files had been scanned, logged, locked away in evidence storage. But this one, the original with its red ink and uneven notations and strange, deliberate silences, I couldn't bring myself to file it. It felt like something unfinished. Like it might still matter to someone. I'd take it out sometimes in the evenings after most people had gone home. Run my fingers along the spine. Reread the scrawled notes. Not because I thought I'd find anything new. Just because I didn't know how to put it away without forgetting what it cost to make it real. We never got full answers about the last name on the list, Mathis. There was no missing persons report that matched, no open file, no body. Alvy followed a few threads, ran it through handwriting software, tried comparing it to Coleman's known samples, even checked with a few behavioral analysts to see if they thought the red ink meant something intentional or just a different pen. But in the end, nothing stuck. It just became another absence we had to live with. Another space left behind in the pattern. Dorothy and I still talk. Not often, but enough. She moved out of the house where Sarah had grown up and took a quieter job at a library near Nashville. Says the quiet helps. Says she still sets a place for her daughter every Christmas. Not out of grief, she told me once, but out of love. I understood. Some losses don't close. They just become part of the way we move through the world. And me, I stayed. Same office, same badge, different cases, but nothing like that one. Nothing that tangled. Nothing that wide. I still keep photos from the drone search pinned to the back of the closet door in the file room. The good ones. The ones where people were walking in long lines, heads down, hands linked. Not because they expected to find anything, but because showing up mattered. Because being willing to look meant something even when you didn't know what was still buried out there. Every so often, someone will ask what it was like. The case, the discoveries, the ending. And I never quite know what to say. Because it wasn't one story, it was a dozen. And not all of them got told the way they deserved. Some families got closure, some got bones, some got silence. But every single one of them reminded me that there's a different kind of justice than what you write in a verdict. Sometimes it's just the truth, finally spoken aloud. Sometimes it's a place to leave flowers. And sometimes it's knowing that even if the world moved on, someone stayed behind to remember. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Not for views, not for numbers, just so no name goes missing twice. Someone out there might still be waiting for a truth they were never told. And maybe, just maybe, they'll find it in the sound of a voice that chose not to forget.